Let's take a look at the big picture for the book of Numbers before we jump into any particulars. This next section is entitled The Big Picture. If you stop and think about it, no matter who we're talking about, if we're talking about adults or we're talking about children, the discontented whining can be difficult to ignore, whether we're talking about children or adults. And in this case, we're talking about Israel. Israel whined, Israel complained, Israel groaned, and Israel in the wilderness characterizes the book of Numbers. Listen to this overview. Again, I don't want to prejudice the book and say that it's something that we should avoid reading. By all means, we should be reading the book. However, it doesn't have a lot of commandments, rather it has a lot of narrative. The book picks up where Exodus leaves off. So it's odd that we have Leviticus sandwiched between Exodus and Numbers, but on a narrative scope, it really goes Exodus and then Numbers. Israel is camped at the base of Mount Sinai. That's where we pick up the reading in the book of Numbers here. And from here, the people journeyed into the wilderness, which the Hebrew word wilderness is Bamidbar. They journeyed into the wilderness of Paran, which is south of the Promised Land. Scouts, if you'll remember, were sent to explore the land and give a report of its inhabitants. And of course, when they returned to the camp, their report was not favorable. We had 12 spies, one from each tribe, and 10 of the 12 gave a non-favorable report. They said maybe they were just pragmatic, maybe they were just doubtful. Either way, they demonstrated a lack of faith in God by giving a report that the people it gave the people the impression that the promises that God was making to them were less than true, or they were less than accurate. Maybe God didn't understand what the people were up against. I'm not sure exactly what was going through the people's mind. But at any rate, the people began to doubt Hashem's ability to give them their inheritance. And as a result, human nature kicks in. What happens when people doubt? Well, the next thing they do is complain. They whine. They grumble. They mumble. Or as again one preacher I heard growing up, he said they murmured, and then he as a kind of an exercise, he said, "You want to know what murmuring's like?" And he had the entire congregation go murmur, 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 murmur. Everybody was doing it like at their own pace, murmur, murmur, murmur. And when you got like 100 or 200 people in a church going murmur, 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 it sounds really stupid. And so it was like an exercise for us to remember, or for us to get an idea of what it was like for God to have to listen to the murmurings of the children of Israel. Now, because of their sin. Because really, they weren't just complaining that the land was too vast or that the giants in the land were too big. They were actually leveling a charge, as it were, against God that this can't be done. God says, you can do it. The people basically said, no, we can't do it. It can't be done. And in essence, they were doubting the providence and the, doubting the competence of God. And so, doubt is a sin. And as a result of their sin, God condemned them to wander in the wilderness until the generation of coveters, the generation of whiners and complainers, until they died off, and a new generation, which was their children, took their place. 40 years, and we're familiar with this story, 40 years they wandered around the desert. I've heard it said, I can't confirm it, but I've heard it said that the journey from Egypt to the Promised Land is, if you were to just go straight through, stopping for camping and allowing for 3 million plus people, of which Israel numbered, if you were to journey through that space, it should only have taken about 11 or 12 days to do the journey. Because the distance isn't that far. It's not like God asked them to go from Egypt to, say, Madagascar or the southern or South Africa. He didn't ask them. He didn't ask them to take a journey that should take 40 years. And so the wandering was supernatural. It's a picture of both God's judgment as well as God's grace at the same time. Because even though they wandered for 40 years, you'll remember, their shoes didn't wear out, and they actually did have food to eat and provision for their cattle and things like that. They just simply walked until their bones dropped into the sand. But 40 years later, or 38 years later, how the rabbis put it, their children slowly made their way back to Canaan. Now, this time, the children having learned the lesson of the parents, the disobedient adults, they're ready to obey the commandments of the Lord. They're ready to actually walk into the statement that they made way back in Exodus chapter 19, where they said, "All that you've said we will do." Remember that statement? Kind of premature, don't you think? And so, in this overview, again, after winning some important campaigns east of the Jordan River, Am Yisrael is actually prepared to enter the heart of the promised land that they had waited so long to see.